The hall was enormous. It floated in space, locked in orbit around a star that had been dying for 1,000 years. The walls were made of something older than most civilizations. The seats inside were carved from stone and metal brought from dozens of worlds. The light inside was pale and cold, and it fell on the faces of creatures that had been ruling the galaxy long before humans had learned to build fires. Teo had been inside this hall many times before. He had walked its long corridors, sat in its waiting rooms, and read the names carved into its walls. Names of species that had signed treaties here, made promises here, and built the order that held the galaxy together. Every time he walked through the main doors, he felt the weight of it. Not in a way that made him afraid, in a way that made him careful. He was Earth's chief ambassador. He had held the position for 11 years. In that time, he had learned the customs of 30 different species. He memorized thousands of pages of interstellar law and sat through more council sessions than he could count. He was good at his job. Everyone who worked with him said so. And still, when he walked into a room full of alien delegates, he could feel the way they looked at him, like he was something small that had wandered in from outside. Humanity had been part of the Galactic Deliberative Council for 43 years. That was nothing. And some of the species sitting in this hall had been members for 4,000 years. To them, Earth was new. Earth was young. Earth was, in their quiet and polite and sometimes not so polite opinion, not quite ready to be taken seriously. Today, Teo was going to make a formal proposal. He had been preparing it for 8 months. The proposal was about the Resource Allocation Accords, a set of rules that decided which species could mine which star systems. Under the current rules, 3 star systems that sat well within Earth's reach were locked away. Humanity could not touch them. The justification in the old treaty language was vague and outdated, written at a time when humans had barely stepped off their own moon. The systems were rich. Humanity needed them. And the legal case for reassigning access rights was, in Teo's careful opinion, airtight. He stood at the center podium. The chamber was full. Every seat was taken by a delegate or an aide. The species of the council surrounded him on all sides, tall ones and short ones, ones with 4 eyes and ones with none, ones that breathed different air and needed sealed suits just to sit in the same room. He had learned all their names. He had studied all their histories. He had even learned a few words in several of their languages as a gesture of respect. He began to speak. He laid out the proposal clearly, point by point. He cited the original treaty language and showed where it had been written under conditions that no longer existed. He showed maps. He showed data about Earth's growing population and its energy needs. He showed how the redistribution would affect no other species negatively. He spoke for 22 minutes. He was calm, organized, and precise. When he finished, the chamber was quiet for a moment. Then the laughter started. It was not loud at first. It came from the section where the Vile Dominion's delegation sat. The Vile were one of the oldest and most powerful members of the council. Their delegate, a tall creature named Oru Selk, had a long gray face and small black eyes that always looked like they were slightly bored. He leaned toward the delegate beside him and said something, and the delegate made a sound that was the Viel version of a laugh, a low, rattling hiss from deep in the throat. Then Oru Selk leaned forward and spoke into his microphone. His voice was translated by the chamber's system in real time. Every word came through clear and flat. "The apes have learned to write petitions," he said. "How charming." More laughter followed. Not from every species. Some sat still and said nothing. but enough laughed that the sound filled the chamber, and Teo stood at the podium and heard all of it. He did not move. His face did not change. He stood there and let the sound wash over him, and he waited for it to stop. The vote was called. It was quick. Council votes were done by color-coded signal. Each delegation pressed a button, and the result appeared on a large display above the chamber floor. Teo watched the display as the signals came in one by one. Every single one was red, not a majority, not a close count. Every species on the council voted against the proposal, including the ones Earth had fed during the Outer Rim famine 6 years ago, when crop failures devastated 3 agricultural worlds and human cargo ships had carried emergency supplies at cost. Including the Kashari, whose border skirmishes in the Kashari corridor had been quietly settled with the help of human diplomatic teams. Including every species that had, at some point in the last 43 years, received something from Earth and smiled and said, "Thank you." Every single one. Anteo looked at the display for a few seconds. Then he gathered his documents. He put them in his case slowly and neatly, the way he always did. He clicked the case shut. He stepped down from the podium. He walked across the chamber floor toward the main doors, and the sound of low conversation followed him like a wave. He did not look back. He did not say anything to the delegates he passed. He pushed open the heavy door and walked into the corridor outside, and the door closed behind him with a low, deep sound. The corridor was empty. The pale light came from strips along the ceiling. His footsteps echoed. He stopped walking. He stood still for a moment. He breathed. Then he reached into his coat pocket and took out a small communication device. He opened a private encrypted channel to Earth. To the office of Director Eugene, head of the Human Intelligence and Diplomatic Cipher Bureau. The line connected. He spoke quietly. He said only 4 words. "Begin the quiet work." Then he closed the line, put the device back in his pocket, and kept walking down the long corridor, alone, toward the docking bay where his ship was waiting to take him home. A year went by. On the surface, nothing changed. Teo returned to the council sessions. He sat in the same seat. He filed the same reports. He attended the same functions where alien diplomats drank their various drinks and made small talk about trade numbers and border agreements. He smiled when it was appropriate to smile. He shook hands and bowed his head and said the right things at the right times. From the outside, it looked like a man doing his job the way he always had. No one in the council paid much attention to Earth. That was normal. It had always been normal. Humanity showed up. Humanity behaved. Humanity did not cause trouble. The older species had grown comfortable with that pattern. They did not think to look underneath it. Director Eugene worked from a building in Seoul that had no sign on the door and no listing in any public record. She had run the Human Intelligence and Diplomatic Cipher Bureau for 9 years, and in that time she had developed a habit of seeing things that other people missed. She was not loud. She was not dramatic. She worked long hours and slept very little, and thought in very straight lines, and when Teo's message came through, she read it once, set it down, and started making calls. Operation Hollow Word began the next morning. The goal of the operation was simple on paper. Earth had signed 67 treaties over 43 years. Trade agreements, resource-sharing pacts, mutual defense clauses, communication access deals, infrastructure partnership contracts, or pharmaceutical supply arrangements, and a dozen other categories of formal agreements. The operations job was to map all of them, not to honor them, not to renegotiate them, but to understand exactly what each one was worth to the other side. The team Yujin assembled worked quietly. They pulled records, they ran numbers, they built models, they tracked supply chains and energy grids and communication routes and medical supply lines that stretched across dozens of star systems. And they worked for months, and when they were done, they brought the results to Yujin in a report that was 300 pages long. She read the whole thing in one sitting. The picture that came out of it was not what most people inside the council would have expected, but it was exactly what Yujin had suspected. Over 43 years, while the older species had been busy looking down at humanity, humanity had quietly become the thing that held the galactic economy together. Human cargo ships carried 61% of all interstellar trade. That number had grown slowly over decades, so slowly that no one had noticed it crossing the majority mark. The routes were efficient, the crews were reliable, and the prices were fair. Other species had been happy to use them. No one had thought to ask what would happen if they stopped running. The relay stations were worse. The Council's communication grid, the network of signal stations that let member species talk to each other across light years, ran on infrastructure that had been built and maintained almost entirely by human engineering teams. It had happened gradually, the way these things always happened. A contract here, a repair job there, a station upgrade offered at a good price. Now, if you pulled the human teams out of the picture, the outer sectors of the council grid would go dark within weeks. Then there were the pharmaceuticals. HFY's research teams, working out of labs on 3 different worlds, had over the years developed a series of life extension compounds that had become essential to 6 council species. The biology of those species made them dependent on regular doses in a way that could not easily be reversed. They had not developed their own production capacity because they had never needed to. The supply had always been there. And then there were the engineers. Hundreds of human construction and maintenance crews worked on the homeworlds and colony stations of council member species, keeping power systems running and water systems clean and atmospheric processors calibrated. They were quiet, professional people who showed up and did the work and asked for nothing except the agreed payment. The species who relied on them had stopped thinking of them as a choice and started thinking of them as furniture. The Yujin sent the full report to Taiyo with a short note. "We are the floor. They have been standing on us for 40 years, and they think they are standing on stone." Meanwhile, in a different part of the operation, physicist HFY was standing inside a long white room on a research station in neutral space, looking at the results of a test that had taken 3 years to reach. Project Stillwater had been running inside a network of stations officially described as deep space atmospheric research posts. The technology inside them was something else entirely. It bent local gravity fields into a directional shear, a focused distortion that could disable a ship's drive systems, navigation array, and hull integrity sensors all at once, without firing a single conventional weapon. A fleet walking into range of a still water station would stop moving. It would not be destroyed. It would simply stop. HFY called Rear Admiral Bo-Ra on a secure line and told her the test results were clean. Bo-Ra was a short, broad-shouldered woman who had commanded fleet operations for 16 years. She had a habit of reading reports twice and never asking unnecessary questions. She read HFY's summary, looked at the numbers, and said, "How many stations are active?" 14, HFY said, positioned across 6 neutral zones. Pre-targeted on the corridors we discussed. "Good," Bo-Ra said. She filed the report and moved on. The signal that finally connected all the pieces came from the edge of council-monitored space. Wu was 26 years old and had been stationed at Relay Post 7 for 8 months. His job was to monitor communication traffic and flag anything unusual. He was not a senior officer. He was not well known. He sat in a small room on a small station and watched data move across his screen day after day. One evening, he noticed something in the deep-range sensor logs. Fleet movement, large ships, military class, belonging to the Vielle Dominion, not heading anywhere obvious, not on any registered patrol route. Moving slowly toward the Kessa Belt, a narrow corridor of space that, if blocked, would cut Earth off from 2 of its colony systems in the outer expansion zones. Wu sat with the data for an hour, checking it twice, then 3 times. Then he encrypted it and sent it up the chain to Bo-Ra with a short header. Bo-Ra read the report that same night. She looked at the fleet positions on the tactical map for a long time. Then she forwarded the full file to Tayo and wrote 4 words in the annotation field. They are pre-positioning, not defending. Tayo received the message the next morning, and he read it at his desk in his office at the council compound, with a cup of coffee going cold beside him. He read it once, then set the message down and looked out the window at the dying star the building orbited. The light through the glass was pale and old. He picked up the coffee, found it cold, and set it back down. Then he opened his calendar and began drafting his response to the council's next scheduled session notice. He accepted the invitation. He confirmed his attendance. He wrote nothing unusual in the reply. But that night, he called Yu-Jin again. "How ready are we?" he asked. There was a short pause on the line. "Ready enough," she said. The notice came through on a Tuesday. The council was calling an emergency session. The agenda was listed in the formal language that council notices always used. Long, careful sentences, full of words that sounded neutral, but were not. The subject was Earth's compliance with something called the Outer Expansion Limitation Clause. Tayo had known this clause existed since his first year as ambassador. It had been buried in one of the early treaties signed during humanity's desperate first decade in the Council, a decade when Earth had needed allies badly enough to agree to almost anything. The clause said that humanity could not establish colonies within 40 light years of any member species' territory without prior Council approval. Karama Station sat in the Doran Expanse. It had been built 3 years ago. 200,000 people lived there. Families, workers, researchers, children who had grown up knowing no other home. It was clean and functional and well managed, and it sat inside the boundary that the Outer Expansion Limitation Clause described. Earth had submitted a notification when the station was first established. Not a request for approval. A notification, because the treaty language had always been vague on whether approval was needed for research and settlement stations versus full military outposts. The notification had been acknowledged and filed. No one had objected for 3 years. Now, suddenly, the Vielle Dominion had filed a formal violation claim. Tayo read the council notice carefully. He read the Vielle Dominion's claim filing. He read the attached legal arguments. Then he sat at his desk for a while and did nothing. He called Bo-Ra. "The fleet," he said. "Where are they?" "Karama Corridor," Bo-Ra said. "They moved 2 more ships in last night. Our count is now 14 Vielle military vessels in pre-strike positioning. If the Council votes to authorize enforcement, they move within hours." "And ours?" "The 3rd Fleet is already in the Doran Expanse," Bo-Ra said. "Ingite has them positioned. All 14 Stillwater stations are online. We are ready." Tayo thanked her and ended the call. He sat quietly for another long moment. Then he opened a drawer in his desk and took out a sheet of paper. Real paper, the kind that came from trees on Earth. He kept a small supply of it. Some of the older human diplomats did. It was a habit that alien delegates always found strange and slightly amusing. A species that had faster-than-light travel still using pressed plant material to write things down. Teo had never explained why he did it. He simply did. He spent 3 hours writing. When he was done, he had a single document, 4 pages, handwritten, then scanned and sent to Eugene for legal review. She came back to him in 40 minutes. Her message said, "Clean, solid, irrevocable." He printed a final copy, folded it, and put it in his coat pocket. The session began at the standard hour. The chamber was full. The lighting was, as always, pale and cold. Teo took his seat in the Earth delegation section and listened as the council's presiding officer opened the session and introduced the matter of Karama Station. The Viel Dominion's representative spoke for a long time, citing treaty law and council precedent and the importance of maintaining the agreements that kept the galactic order stable. Other delegates spoke in support. The language was smooth and formal and well prepared. Then the presiding officer opened the floor to Earth. Teo stood up. He walked to the center podium. He placed nothing on it. He had no notes in his hands, no screen, no presentation. He stood there for a moment and looked at the chamber around him. Every face, every pair of eyes, every creature that had voted against his proposal a year ago and laughed when Oru Selk made his joke about apes. He reached into his coat pocket and took out the folded paper document. He unfolded it slowly. He walked forward and placed it flat on the council table in front of the presiding officer. Then he stepped back to the podium. "This is not a rebuttal," he said. His voice was calm. It was not loud. "It is not a counter-proposal. It is not a request." He paused for exactly 1 second. "It is Earth's formal and total withdrawal from every treaty currently on record with the Galactic Deliberative Council." The silence was complete. It was the kind of silence that happens when a room full of people all stop breathing at the same time. "All 67 of them," he said. He looked at the presiding officer, then let his gaze move slowly across the chamber. "You voted unanimously against us once," he said. "We will now return the courtesy." He stepped down from the podium. He picked up his case. He walked toward the doors. No one spoke. No one moved. The door opened, and he walked through it, and it closed behind him. What followed in the next 12 hours was not a reaction. It was an execution. It was a plan that had been built over a year, tested at every stage, and was now running exactly as designed. Human cargo ships across 6 star systems received a single encrypted instruction. They diverted. Every route that ran through council-connected space was redirected, rerouted, or simply stopped. Trade lanes that had been running without interruption for decades went quiet. Ships already in transit completed their current runs and then held position at neutral waypoints, waiting for new orders that would not come for some time. At the same moment, human maintenance teams on 3 council-member homeworlds received their own orders. They stopped work. They packed their equipment. They walked to their transport ships and lifted off. The atmospheric processors, the power grid substations, the water filtration systems, all of it was left in functional condition. The teams did not sabotage anything. They simply left. Pharmaceutical shipments to the 6 dependent species were quietly rerouted to a series of human-controlled storage depots in neutral space. The supply was not destroyed. It was simply no longer in transit. And then the relay stations went dark. 41 human-operated signal stations across the outer sectors powered down their broadcasting arrays one by one, beginning at the edge of council space and moving inward. The communication grid did not collapse instantly. It degraded. It went patchy, then slow, then silent in whole sections. Council members trying to send messages to allies found their signals going nowhere. In the Doran expanse, the Viel fleet began to move toward Karama Station. They came in formation, 14 ships, moving at a pace that said they were not expecting a fight. They expected a settlement of 200,000 civilians and perhaps a light defensive post. They found Bo-Ra's third deep space fleet instead. Giti's command ship sat at the front of the human formation, still and quiet. Behind it, in precise lines, sat the rest of the fleet. And behind them, spread across the corridor at calculated intervals, the 14 Stillwater stations hummed in standby mode, invisible on standard scans, calibrated on every ship in the approaching column. There was no declaration of war. There was no speech. There was only a single automated signal broadcast on all available frequencies, including every channel the Council still had access to. This is a civilian settlement. The next ship that crosses this line will be the last one that does. The Viel fleet stopped, and their lead ship held position for 11 minutes. Teo, watching the sensor feed from his ship, counted every one of them. Then the Viel formation began, slowly, to pull back. He watched until they were gone from the display. Then he set down the sensor feed, leaned back in his chair, and closed his eyes for a moment, not in relief, and not in triumph, in something quieter than either of those things, something that had no name in any of the 30 languages he had learned. Then he opened his eyes, sat forward, and got back to work. The Council did not fall apart all at once. It came undone slowly, the way a rope frays, one thread at a time, in places no one was watching, until one day you pull on it, and the whole thing comes loose in your hands. The first 72 hours were mostly confusion. Council members tried to reach each other through the communication grid and found large sections of it unreliable. Messages that should have taken minutes took hours, and some did not arrive at all. The delegates who were still inside the main council station when Teo walked out spent those first hours in meetings with each other, trying to understand what had just happened and what it meant. Most of them did not understand it yet. They thought it was a negotiating move. They thought Earth was angry and dramatic and would come back to the table within a week. Several senior delegates said exactly that in their internal briefings. Give it time, then they will return. They always return. The newcomers always came back. That was the pattern. That was how it always worked. They had never seen a newcomer that had spent a year preparing to leave. By the end of the first week, the trade disruption was impossible to ignore. 61% of interstellar cargo volume had been carried by human ships. That number, when spread across the daily movement of goods between dozens of worlds, and translated into shortages that were small at first but growing. Processed food stocks that were supposed to arrive on 3 colony stations did not arrive. Raw materials that manufacturing facilities had been expecting sat in holding at neutral waypoints. Passenger transport between council worlds slowed to a fraction of normal capacity. The Vael Dominion moved to call a council response session. Oru Selk argued for collective action, a formal declaration that Earth's withdrawal was illegal under treaty law, combined with a coordinated show of military force to bring humanity back into compliance. His argument was confident. It sounded, to those who agreed with it, like exactly the kind of firm response the Council needed. It failed before it could be voted on. The problem was the pharmaceutical dependency. 3 of the species Oruselk needed for his coalition were dependent on compounds that came from human labs. Without those compounds, their populations would begin to experience serious health deterioration within months. They could not afford a prolonged conflict with Earth. 2 of them pulled out of the coalition discussion within 48 hours. The third sent a private message to Yujin's office before the week was out. Yujin read the message. She noted it in the operations log. She did not respond. The Kashari sent their message on day 4. The Kashari were a small amphibious species, soft-spoken, careful, known within the council for being reliable vote followers rather than independent actors. Their ocean-world cities ran on a desalination system that had been designed, built, and maintained by human engineering teams. Without the maintenance crews, the systems began to lose calibration. The water output dropped in quality first, then in volume. The Kashari engineers who tried to take over the work found documentation that was thorough and complete. The human teams had always kept excellent records, but the practical experience needed to run the systems was something that took years to develop, not days. The message from the Kashari delegate was long and carefully worded. It expressed deep regret for the events that had led to Earth's decision. It invoked the spirit of shared responsibility. It asked, and in language that was polite enough to almost hide how desperate it was, whether some arrangement could be reached. Yujin filed it without responding. Inside the council, the blame sessions began in the second week. The recordings of those sessions eventually leaked. No one ever confirmed how, and the galaxy heard the delegates shouting at each other in the formal language of interstellar diplomacy, which was somehow more painful than ordinary shouting. They accused each other of having allowed Earth to become too embedded, of having been too comfortable, of not watching what the humans were doing while everyone was busy laughing at them. The recording of Oruselk's words from a year ago circulated again, carried now on the few communication channels that were still functioning. The apes have learned to write petitions. Those words had been funny once, or at least the kind of thing that sounded clever in a room full of people who agreed with each other. Now they sat in the air differently. Now they were the words that explained everything, why Earth had left, and why it had been ready when it did. Several neutral species reached out to Teo through back channels. They were careful and indirect in their approach, using third-party intermediaries and non-council communication lines. They framed their messages as expressions of concern rather than requests. They talked about the importance of stability, of dialogue, of the long history of cooperative progress that the council represented. Teo met with each of them. He was polite, as he always was. He listened. When they were done speaking, he placed a document on the table in front of them. It was not the withdrawal notice. It was something new, a framework, drafted by Earth's legal team over the past year alongside everything else, laying out the terms under which humanity would be willing to engage going forward. The document was short. The terms were clear. He did not explain them. He did not argue for them. He simply said, "When you are ready to discuss this seriously, we are available." None of them were ready yet. They left and went back to the council and reported that Teo had been impossible, which was a thing people often said about someone whose position they could not find a weakness in. On Earth, Secretary General Dassault addressed the United Earth government in a session that was broadcast live to every human colony and settlement in the galaxy. She was not a dramatic speaker. She did not use grand language. She spoke the way she always spoke, directly, without decoration. She said that humanity had not left the council out of pride. She said they had left because they had never truly been welcome in it. She said that for 43 years, human workers had built roads on alien worlds, powered cities that their own people were not allowed to live in, and fed populations that voted against them with food carried on human ships. Inchi would not ask for a seat at a table. It would not ask for a seat at a table. It could simply replace. The speech moved through human space quickly. People on colony stations watched it on their screens during shift breaks. Families on outer settlements watched it together at home. Soldiers on the edge fleets watched it in their mess halls. Yet there were no celebrations exactly. It was not that kind of speech, and this was not that kind of moment. But something passed through human space that week that had not been there before. Something that felt like standing up straight after years of being slightly bent. Wu, at Relay Post 7, watched the broadcast alone in the small room where he monitored signal traffic. When it was over, he sat for a while in the quiet, thinking about the fleet movements he had flagged weeks ago, and the message he had sent to Bo-Ra, and how small a part he had played in something very large. Then he turned back to his screens and went back to work. The relay stations stayed dark. The cargo ships stayed in their holding positions. The maintenance crews stayed off the alien worlds. The pharmaceutical depots sat sealed in neutral space. The council kept meeting. The sessions grew shorter and less organized as the weeks passed and the shortages spread. The confident voices that had laughed a year ago grew quieter. The voices that had always been quiet grew a little louder, asking questions that should have been asked long before now. How dependent are we? How long can this last? What do we actually have without them? The answers were not good. And in the background, steady and unhurried, Tayo waited. They came on a Thursday morning. 11 ships arrived at Earth's primary orbital station. Not warships, not military escorts, on just standard diplomatic vessels with council markings and neutral flag identifiers. They sent a request for docking clearance through the normal channels, which was almost funny, given that the normal channels ran through human relay stations. The request was processed by a young traffic officer who passed it up the chain and got clearance back within the hour. Tayo was on Earth when the message came through. He read the list of delegations aboard those 11 ships and recognized most of the names. Some of them had been in the chamber the day Oruselk made his joke. Some of them had pressed the red button when the vote was called. He read the list twice, then put the message down and looked out the window of his office at the morning sky for a moment. Then he packed a case, called his team, and went to the station. Yu-Jin met him at the docking corridor. She had dark circles under her eyes and a cup of coffee in each hand. She gave him one without being asked. He took it. They walked together through the white corridor toward the conference suite, and neither of them said much because there was not much that needed to be said. The conference room was ordinary. That had been a deliberate choice. Tayo had been the one to choose it. No great hall, no formal chamber, no walls carved from ancient stone. A clean room with white walls, a long table, chairs, water, and coffee. The kind of room where humans made decisions every day. The alien delegates, when they filed in and took their seats, looked around briefly in the way that people do when they expected something grander and found something plainer instead. Then they looked at Tayo, and he looked at them, and the session began. The lead envoy represented a coalition of 9 species. He was a tall, thin creature who spoke slowly and chose his words with great care. He began by addressing the history, not all of it, just the recent portion, the year that had passed since the walkout. He framed things in the language of mutual misunderstanding. He spoke about the complexity of managing a large and diverse galactic community. He said the council had perhaps, at times, failed to properly recognize the contributions of all its members. He said that this was something that needed to change. He spoke for a long time. It was the kind of speech designed to acknowledge a problem without fully naming it, to express regret without fully accepting fault. Tayo had heard many speeches like it over the years. He knew how to listen to them without reacting. When the envoy finished, the room was quiet. Tayo set down his coffee. He reached into his case and took out a document, printed on paper, as always because he was who he was, and laid it flat on the table. He slid it forward until it was in front of the lead envoy. "This is what we're working with," he said. The envoy looked at it. "Is this a new treaty proposal?" "No," Tayo said. "It is not a treaty. It is not an application to rejoin the council. It is a bilateral framework." He let that sit for a moment. Every species that wants access to human cargo routes, human pharmaceuticals, human engineering services, or human communications infrastructure will negotiate directly with Earth, independently, one at a time, on terms that Earth sets. There is no council override. There is no collective veto. There is no group decision that allows 11 species to move as one against one. The lead envoy looked at the document. Then he looked at the delegates on either side of him. Some of them were very still. "You are asking us to dissolve the council's collective framework," one of the other delegates said. A wide-bodied creature from a species Tayo recognized as one of the older members, one that had been in the chamber longer than any other species represented today. "I am not asking anything," Tayo said quietly. "Earth is not applying for membership. Earth is not petitioning for rights. Those days are over." He nodded toward the document. "What I am offering is a working relationship, a real one, not one where you vote on whether we matter." The room was very quiet for a long moment. The Kashari delegate, the same species whose desalination systems had been slowly losing function for 3 months, leaned forward. He did not look at the document. He looked at Tayo. "Our water systems," he said. It was not a full sentence. It was not meant to be. Tayo looked at him steadily. "Your engineers have the documentation. Once a bilateral agreement is signed, our maintenance teams will return within the week. And before the agreement is signed?" "Your engineers have the documentation," Tayo said again. The Kashari delegate leaned back and said nothing more. The session lasted 4 hours. There were no dramatic moments after that. There were questions about specific clauses, about timelines, about the logistics of transitioning from council-brokered arrangements to bilateral ones. Tayo and Yujin answered each question precisely. Where Earth was flexible, they said so. Where it was not, they said so plainly. By the end of the session, nothing had been signed. But the shape of what was coming was clear to everyone in the room. 3 species signed bilateral agreements within the week. 5 more in the following 2 weeks. The last of the 11 took 6 weeks and 2 additional sessions before their delegate put pen to paper, or the alien equivalent of it. And as each agreement was signed, things came back online. Cargo routes reopened, 1 lane at a time. Maintenance teams returned to the worlds that had signed. Pharmaceutical shipments resumed, tracked and documented under the new bilateral terms. The communication network rebuilt itself, not through council nexus points, but through human relay stations that now operated under direct bilateral access contracts. It was the same infrastructure it had always been, but now it was clear, to everyone, whose infrastructure it was. Wu was at his station at Relay Post 7 when the signals started coming back in. He watched the display as lines of communication traffic reappeared across the grid, rerouting through human-controlled stations, each one representing a species that had sat across a table from Tayo and agreed to Earth's terms. He watched the grid fill in slowly, like light spreading across a dark room. He typed up a short report and sent it to Bo-Ra. He described what he was seeing in the signal traffic, added one line that was not really part of the message, added one line that was not really part of the report. He wrote it anyway. "We're lighting up again, Admiral, but it's on our grid now." Bo-Ra read the message in her cabin on the command ship, still holding position in the Doran expanse near Karama Station. She read it twice, and then she set the message down and looked out the small porthole beside her desk at the stars outside. Cold, distant, indifferent, beautiful. She had spent 30 years in service. She had seen a lot. She was not easily moved, but she was smiling. On Earth, Tayo took a few days of leave after the final agreement was signed. He traveled by train to the city where he had grown up, and from there he took a road that went up through low hills to a small cemetery on a slope facing east. He found his father's grave without needing to look for it. He had been coming here since he was a child. His father had applied to the Colonial Diplomatic Service 40 years ago, when interstellar diplomacy was still new and exciting, and the galaxy seemed full of possibility. He had made it through every stage of the selection process until the very last one, which included an evaluation by a panel of allied species representatives who were there to assess whether candidates had the qualities needed for interstellar work. The evaluator from one of the older species had written a single sentence in the assessment report that ended his father's application. Tayo had found the record years ago and read that sentence so many times he no longer needed to look it up. The candidate shows promise, but humanity is not yet complex enough for this level of representation. He stood by the grave for a long time. The morning was cool and clear. The light came from the east over the hills and lay across the grass and the stone in long gold lines. A bird was singing somewhere in the trees below. It was very quiet. Tayo stood there and let the quiet settle around him. He was not thinking about the council. He was not thinking about the agreements or the grid or the bilateral frameworks, and he was just standing there, in the place where his father was buried, in the country where he was born, on the planet that had built the floor the galaxy was standing on. After a while, he straightened his coat. He turned around and walked back down the hill toward the road. There was a transport waiting to take him to the station. There was a ship waiting at the station to take him back to orbit. There was work waiting in orbit that would take years to finish. He walked at a normal pace, not fast, not slow. The light was warm on his back. The bird was still singing. He had a lot of work to do.